looking at the video footage, what was your impression or your views about Michael? Any observations?
He wasn't taking any responsibility whatsoever, was he?
Wasn't taking any responsibility,
No.
you're right. Yeah.
I think he has an alter ego. He was two different people. He was this violent character and also this quite old and normal, able to talk rationally character.
So yes, yeah, altered ego. Anybody see him as a potential killer? Yeah. He was planning on killing Dawn. The officers, when they went, there's information which isn't broadcast on the programme, this information I've been able to gain, was that actually when the officers went there, they arrested Michael. The officer contacted the custody suite because obviously you notify the custody suite to say you bring the prisoner in, and they said, well, the custody suite was full, and they were asking, was the arrest necessary? The officer realised that this was a real risky situation and decided he was still going to arrest because he had this uneasy feeling about it. And he probably picked up that Michael had been arrested on 2 previous occasions within the 8 days. On the second time, he actually coercively controlled the police officer because they actually took him back home because they felt sorry for him. But from the investigation, they identified that he was definitely planning to kill her, and I think that was probably reflected in his sentence. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, which for the assault was quite a hefty sentence. But as I say, I think that's probably reflected on what the planning was, that he was going to actually kill her. The mention of coercive control, what we know, and within your packs there is some information there that helps you to recognise some of the signs of coercive control. But we know that it's usually personalised and that it can take various forms, and it often involves a pattern of continuing or repeated abuse. It can be routine or low level to outside observers. So you may look at something, well, thinking that's not particularly concerning, but to the person who has been subjected to it, for them it's just abject fear, because they know what that behaviour is going to lead up to when you're not there. You're very conscious of how that behaviour causes significant fear for that individual. I want to talk about some cases that have examples, and these cases from Wales, where old people have been subjected to domestic abuse. And the first one was of an elderly lady. She was in her late 70s, and she'd been admitted to hospital. And while she was in hospital, she disclosed to staff that she did not want to go home to her husband because he was not a particularly pleasant man, and she felt that he would not be able to assist her in her recovery. By the time that went through to the safeguarding process, she'd actually been discharged home, and arrangements were made for her to be visited by the safeguarding officer, the social worker. The safeguarding officer had a considerable amount of experience in dealing with domestic abuse kind of cases, knew what the services that were available to that person. So it was going into that situation on an informed basis about what the opportunities, what the options were for that particular lady. And when I actually spoke to her, she disclosed that the abuse had been ongoing for over 40 years, approaching 50 years, and that she actually hated her husband. And that meeting with her, actually her daughter was present as well, and the daughter confirmed that everything that this lady was saying was accurate. And in fact, the daughter said she absolutely hated her father because she felt that he was a pig of a man, and that was her own words, that he was a really unpleasant individual. So there was a discussion then about what the options were for in terms of remaining in the property, moving into a refuge, moving into other kinds of property that might be able to meet her needs, or going into a care home. And the lady did not want to make that decision there and then, and that's the thing, we have to let people think and consider what the options are, given the time. Now, for some of us professionals working in high-pressure situations, sometimes you want to know the answers there and then. It doesn't always work with older people. And what I would say is don't rush them. Let them have the opportunity to reflect on what's being said and then let them make the decision. The decision that lady made was that she wanted to go into a care home. And I think that was particularly sad that her options, and they were limited options for her, but she felt that that was the best for her situation. And indeed, a few weeks later, she went into a care home. The other case that was a gentleman who was being abused by his wife. His wife had a condition which was described as being morbid jealousy. Basically, what she believed was that every woman he spoke to, he looked at, he was having an affair with that lady. This is a gentleman who had capacity, so he was able to make decisions around his safety, where he lived, etc. But actually, during the course of a period of time, he'd been subjected to a number of assaults. On one occasion, she'd hit him across the head with a heavy padlock, which split his head open. The police were involved in that. He made it quite clear that he was not willing to prosecute. However, the officers decided that they, through their investigation, they felt that perhaps if she was cautioned, that might jolt her into perhaps taking some responsibility for her behaviour. She took no notice of that, and the abuse continued. He subsequently suffered a stroke and was then admitted into hospital, and even whilst he was in hospital, the staff noticed how aggressive she was towards him. And in fact, they were very conscious of having female nurses caring for him, because again, this jealousy situation would kick in where she would be quite aggressive towards him. That resulted then in him being well enough to be discharged home with a care package. So there was a meeting with all the agencies involved through the safeguarding process to look at what were the options in terms of him returning home. He'd made the decision, he had the capacity to say, I want to go home. That was his right. So the decision was that he would go home with an increased package of care, but that the carers going into the property would only be male carers, to again reduce the risk of her aggressive behaviour. The safeguarding lead was concerned about the mental health situation with this lady. The mental health services said that she did not have a mental health problem, it was a behavioural problem, but they were asked to undertake a review of that decision, and they actually managed to get the lady in for an assessment, which is quite an achievement. But actually, when she did go in for an assessment, they ended up in actually sectioning her because they realised that there was a significant mental health problem. So she remained within a mental health hospital for the rest of the days, because I think it was within about 6 months she passed away. But you can see where during that 6 months she could have potentially ended up killing him, because when they were observed at home, the aggression continued. It was a continuous problem which was identified by a number of carers, and the carers would always report those concerns. So you have to take your hats off to those carers that they were very conscious of the situation. They were informed what was going on and what to do should they identify an ongoing issue. The last case was of a gentleman who did not have capacity. He had suffered a stroke, and he was at home being cared for by his son and daughter-in-law. The son and daughter-in-law had actually sold their property and had moved in with the father. There was also the mother was also living at the house. She had quite a severe disability. She suffered a stroke. She did have a level of capacity, but with the gentleman, it was observed by carers that were going in, and incidentally there were a change of a number of agencies because of the aggressive conduct of the daughter-in-law. And what they actually reported was that the daughter-in-law would be extremely rough in the handling of this gentleman, because she was actually trying to deliver personal care as well. As a result of the concerns raised by the carers, that resulted in a police investigation, because they were looking at offences under the Mental Capacity Act, under Section 44 of the Mental Capacity Act, specific offence for those people who lack capacity. The daughter-in-law was interviewed, and following on from that investigation, the police decided there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. During the time the investigation was ongoing, the gentleman had actually been admitted to hospital because he had a medical condition that needed hospital involvement. And it was during that time that he was in hospital, there were considerations then about him returning home, but then there was the situation is he going to be put back into that environment where abuse was taking place? So that ended up then in a multi-agency meeting looking at the best interests under the deprivation of liberty safeguarding process under the Mental Capacity Act. And the group got together because they were very conscious that the family were potentially going to take legal action, so it could be a case that went to the court protection. So what happened in terms of that particular case, the social worker was asked to review all the notes about the contact with the gentleman prior to him losing his capacity and try to identify what he saw his relationship with his daughter-in-law. And a review of the notes actually identified that he had actually stated that he absolutely hated his daughter-in-law, that he recognised that their relationship was strained, but he also said, under no circumstances would I ever want to go into a care home. I'm quite prepared to still stay in the household regardless of the situation with my daughter-in-law. And that was quite a telling point in that particular case, because he'd already made that decision, whilst he had the capacity to do so, to stipulate what he wanted to do in terms of where he should reside. So the decision was made then that there would be a significantly increased package of care, that the daughter-in-law was told under no certain terms that any future conduct on her behalf would be subject to the police investigation. And it was quite interesting that when that meeting ended, the daughter-in-law was told that she basically had been abusing her father-in-law, and she never challenged that, which you would expect, because she was quite an aggressive individual, but she never challenged that comment that was made by the safeguarding officer. And also, when the meeting ended, the son-in-law turned around and said, what happens if I don't want my father to come home? Which is quite an interesting point, because I think the son realised that providing that care during the daytime was not a problem because you've got carers going. It's at night time, which is the real challenge, because this gentleman would not stay in bed at night time. He would get up, which we know is quite a common feature with people with dementia, because obviously time is of sometimes no relevance. And that was quite an interesting point. The sad thing about that particular case was that the gentleman actually died a few weeks later in hospital. So we never knew what would have happened if he had gone home. But I think this sort of emphasises the importance of all the agencies working together and looking at the situation. And what we find also with people with dementia is that families are really under significant strain, and it's important that the agencies recognise that and make sure that they are adequately supported. So I'm just going to go on to the presentation. Just gives you a flavour of what the situation is like. You go backward. Okay, so what do we know? Population, over 3 million people in Wales. So 26% of our population, we're an Asian population, this is going to increase in probably about 10 years' time, we'll have over 1 million older people in Wales. Estimated people across the UK with dementia, we've got 800,000 older people, it's actually 850,000 which has been reported, but they say that 800,000 of those are older people. The reason why I talk about dementia in this context is that dementia, in terms of older abuse, is recognised as a significant risk factor, probably the most significant risk factor that would affect older people. So just be conscious that within some of those home environments, there are very, very difficult situations which could result in violence being perpetrated by the person who's caring, or also by the person with that dementia. So it's important, again, that we recognise and look to support those people where that is a problem. I've put here some domestic homicides. These are from England. I have purposely not put anything there in relation to homicides involving older people in Wales. There have been some. But I think just want to emphasise that older people are being killed by family members. I'll have a few time just to reflect on this. So you can see there some lessons that could have been learned from each of those cases. They are in your packs if you want to have a read in more detail. I'm just conscious of the time. But what I've also put up here is the data or the stats in relation to domestic homicide reviews. The first year of the homicide reviews is the 2011-2012 period. So the legislation was a bit slow in being introduced because there were lots of issues around how they would operate. But as you can see that over the last 3 years of the data, there's been quite a significant increase in the percentage of older people who are being killed by a family member. When you look at the actual numbers, we'll go on to that in a minute, of reported incidents, this is totally out of context in terms of the numbers of what is actually being reported. So it's quite a significant figure. And actually, of the people for the last period, that was the 26 that were killed, 17 of those were aged over 70. So again, it's a problem which people haven't got eyes on. I actually asked the Home Office, of these people that were killed by their family members, actually how many of those had dementia? And I couldn't answer that question, which I thought was really disappointing, because if you're looking for the lessons to be learned, you have to know what was the most significant factors in those homicides. If we don't know what those factors are, then how are we going to address it? Because these are about lessons to be learned, and we can share those lessons and look to improve our responses to those kind of situations. Incidentally, as you can see, 5 male victims, the male victims were all killed by their partners. The female victims, there were 3 by other family members, and we think that was probably grandchildren. Back in September last year, the Metropolitan Police, they actually announced that they had noticed an increase in domestic homicides involving older people, and what they particularly identified was that these were being perpetrated by the grandchildren, and usually there was an underlying issue around financial abuse was the motive in most cases, because usually found that the grandchildren had other issues around substance misuse and were financially abusing their grandparents so that they could fund their habits, etc. Quite a significant factor. Okay, can you see this? I know you've got it in your scale, but basically this is telling us what we believe to be the scale of domestic abuse of older people. Back in 2007, the Department of Health did a study of older people aged 65 living within their own homes and asked them had they been abused or neglected in the previous 12 months by either a family member or a carer. And what that actually disclosed was that 2.6% of all those people asked disclosed that they had been abused or neglected by a family member. For Wales, that was for England and Wales, but actually for Wales it was 3.1% actually disclosed that they'd been abused by a family member. So you've got the 27,000, we estimate, I mean that is a real conservative, I think it was much higher than 27,000. But that's basically what the research has indicated. You've got the next figure then, the total number of recorded domestic abuse victims for Wales, and that's from the police data. So you've got 2,200 being reported. Now, across Wales, the whole incidents were nearly 50,000 incidents. So older people are making up quite a small percentage of what is being reported to the police. So you're looking at probably about just 2 or 3%. In terms of domestic homicides, it's 22%. So you can see where there's a big discrepancy in what is being reported for the incidents as opposed to domestic homicide data. Total number of reported crimes, because not every incident will be a crime, but you can see it's over 600, and of those there were, as it favored our arrests, and then we go down to Marrocks, just 203 Marrocks. Is anybody not familiar with Marrocks? If you are, please put your hand up, you won't be the only one. Everybody's aware, right. For the number of Marrocks we would expect to be conducted across Wales would be roughly about 10 to 15% of all cases. So we'd expect it between 250 and 260 Marrocks. So there's areas of improvement in that regard.
So could you just clarify what Marrock is?
Multi-agency risk assessment conference. Basically this brings all agencies together looking at high-risk cases, and they then, through a multi-agency approach, will develop an action plan that is aimed at protecting the victim and other family members from that continuing abuse. That's basically put in here, but we can go into more detail if you wish later. So you can see in terms of prosecutions, these are completed cases, so there will be other cases which have not been completed, In other words, they're waiting trial, etc. But you can see we're talking down to the 60s. So in terms of accessing justice, are those older people accessing that justice? This is a project that we ran down in Swansea for 12 months when I was seconded to the Welsh Government, focusing on older people. During the course of the 12 months, we had 152 incidents, as you can see. What was quite interesting, that 2/3 of the relevant cases, the criminal or civil justice options was never discussed with the victims. And quite a high proportion of these cases were incidents that police officers had gone to, and the other ones then were the social services. They were the highest sort of reporting of incidents during the programme. Physical violence was 56% of males. The males suffered more physical violence than females, which was, again, sort of the way we always think about domestic abuse as being on physical abuse. Normally we think it's the female, but for male victims, that changes. And I think a lot of that is down to the sons and grandson or grandchildren perpetrating the violence. The dash RIC, that's a risk assessment form. They weren't always being asked the questions. So you can see 66 were only completed, 58 by police. So when you think of the 152 incidents, we're not really drilling down to find out what are the risks for that individual. And 10 victims lack mental capacity. They should have been referred to an independent mental capacity advocate. It's a legal requirement under the Mental Capacity Act for those people to receive the appropriate support. It was never considered for those 10 people. And as you can see, 70% of those incidents, consent was not sought or indicated. Again, if you're working in a multi-agency environment, you need to have that consent or indicated that consent has been obtained for you to respond to it. And again, that was a significant issue we identified. Thirdly, the cases, the level of risk was less than what we expected. And the reason why that was the risk assessment or the dash RIC. Some of the questions did not relate to the issues regarding older people. I mentioned earlier about dementia being a high risk factor. The original or the current one being used by some agencies does not include the question about dementia. The other risk factor is where the main carer is the perpetrator as well. Again, that's not a question. Physical frailty, again, is not a question. So what we've done within the Older People's Commissioner's Office, we have reviewed that dash RIC, as we call it, and have included those questions, but we haven't taken anything out of the original risk assessment checklist. So it hasn't removed the questions in relation to pregnancy, etc. We think this is more focused on everybody. It sort of represents the wider population. Because what a lot of older people say is that the dash RIC, is in its original format, does not consider older people as extensively as it could do. 10 cases we referred to Marek. You can see on there, the year before, not a single older person was referred to Marek. Because they were basically not being identified. Some of the cases would be recognised as a safeguarding issue and would be then sent to the safeguarding team to deal with, and then depending on the skill of that safeguarding officer as to whether they would involve all the relevant agencies, or whether they would, some areas would recognise it as perhaps not being a safeguarding issue, would either close the case or may refer on to another agency. So that was something that was picked up through that pilot project. I'm just looking at the time. Yeah. Okay, so that's a brief introduction into some of the issues, some of the hidden problems that older people are experiencing. So it's about us basically opening our eyes and recognising this as a problem and then actually responding to it. Is there any questions anybody wants to ask? Yes?
I find it quite shocking, really, that out of all those cases, 2,700, 27,000, there's only 53 that have actually gone to CPS and conviction was achieved.
That's the completed cases. There may have been another 50, waiting. And also, we had a bit more information from the police from one of the forces saying that some of these cases would be dealt with by way of a caution. Or there may be that there was insufficient evidence because the victim was not willing to cooperate and there was no other independent forms of evidence that would enable them to take forward prosecution without the involvement of the victim. I think when we see the video cameras that officers wear, I think that's going to go a long way when you go to an incident. To try and put that into a statement, really challenging. It wouldn't portray the full story. Whereas that video footage, which I know a lot of forces now are going down that route of using video footage to capture, which I think is very crucial evidence, we should be able to see an increase in the number of cases being prosecuted. So I think that was quite damaging when you looked at that. You didn't need a statement off that lady, because it was quite obvious to everybody what had been going on, and the way she behaved, and his response. He was very calm and collected, and this is what happens with a lot of people. They are very calm and collected, and they do not portray what we would think is somebody being extremely angry. They contain that angriness until everybody's out of sight, except for the victim.
How much training do the actual police officers get in regards to safeguarding?
Well, we have got some police officers in the audience. I think it's, from my experience when I was a police officer, it was very limited for frontline staff. If you went into a specialised department, and obviously you'd have quite significant training. But I always remember, and I mean I'm going back many years ago, when I first joined the police, on domestic abuse training, or domestic violence as it was, and I think I'd have an hour. And it was like, the instruction was just to separate the couples and try and find out what was happening. So our understanding then was extremely poor. But I mean now, the amount of training, the information, the guidance the police officers has moved a long way. But sometimes you then look at the individual and how we as an individual would respond, having even had that training, how we would interpret that training. For some people, they're quite passionate. It's a human nature. It doesn't matter what organisation you're from. If you're passionate about something, then you'll perhaps go that extra mile. But that doesn't always apply to everybody. So in terms of their training, I think the training has increased or has improved certainly a lot significantly from when I first started. And I think we have to take recognition of that.
They give about a week's worth of training now.
Pardon?
So on the initial course when they start, they get a week's package of surrounding.
So yeah, so it's your bread and butter, isn't it? It's your core business. It's the high risk business. So we look at all the cases where there's been criticism. I think there's been a big wake-up call. I know a lot of forces. It's real priority as part of their strategic plan, and that's reflected. They recognise it. At the end of the day, they're all accountable as well. Each individual is as well as one of the organisation.
Yeah, as police officers, it improves all the time. They look at things and they can make things better.
Yeah.
So now when a response officer goes to a domestic incident, before the job is closed, they have to give like a risk assessment score initially.
Yeah, so that should all be completed prior to COVID.
So you see, there are significant improvements. I'm conscious of the time I'm getting. So yes.
I used to serve on a domestic abuse forum, and I was also part of a local authority's adult protection team. My question is that I now support people who help vulnerable adults, who could be elderly people. If they suspect that something is wrong, who should they report to? The domestic abuse line or the protection of vulnerable adults officer?
You could report to both. We got a presentation from the helpline today. If you're unsure, I would say, obviously if there's immediate risk, then I would contact the police. That would be my advice. If it's something you're not sure of and you want to seek that advice, then the helpline is a 24-hour helpline. I know Anne's going to do a presentation today, but I would say, also, if you've got a concern, report to safeguarding as well. Let them make the decision. It's about making sure that information gets passed on, that you don't gatekeep that information. And I know then that can cause a lot of anxiety for people having that information and thinking, what do I do with it? My recommendation is about trying to get the consent of that person if they've got capacity, and then reporting it, or if you're not
I've
sure.
now been asked to write guidelines on who to report to and how. So.
Yeah, I would say there are various ways of reporting. You report it, you can say contact the helpline, you can report it. And that's what we always encourage, is to report your concern. You've got the Social Services and Wellbeing Act coming in next year, where there will be a legal requirement for the local authority to cause inquiries to be made where there's an adult at risk. So it does put a legal responsibility on people to report and those inquiries to be made. So again, it's, you know, this has been supported by the legislation. We've also got the Violence Against Women and Domestic Abuse legislation as well, which again sets up certain requirements for people. So in terms of what the agency working, a lot of guidance there, which is going to help to inform people. We've also worked with Welsh Government in developing guidance for frontline staff, working in health, social care, housing, etc. So that's going to be coming up for consultation in the new year, so please keep an eye out for it. And it is aimed at those frontline staff. So again, it's about educating people, saying this is the situation, gives you that guidance what to do under those kind of circumstances. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.